Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
A lot of news pertaining to one subject in particular, and that is the looming ban of TikTok in the United States. It's, of course, supposed to go into effect on January 19th if they don't divest their U.S. operations. This is actually happening because of bipartisan legislation that passed through both chambers of Congress and was signed into law by President Biden last year. But, of course, a new president is coming in. And we learned yesterday that the CEO of TikTok, Shou Chew, met with Donald Trump, the president-elect, at Mar-a-Lago. This is after TikTok asked the Supreme Court to intervene to stop the ban, at least for now, and after we heard Trump earlier in the day in a news conference at Mar-a-Lago talking about his feelings about the platform.
We'll take a look at TikTok. You know, I have a warm spot in my heart for TikTok because I won youth by 34 points. And there are those that say that TikTok has something to do with it. TikTok had an impact, and so we're taking a look at it.
Now, Emerson College is out with some new polling around TikTok, and that maybe does support the idea of youth wanting it to stick around. Half of voters under 30, according to Emerson's data, oppose this ban. So joining me now for more is Spencer Kimball. He is the director of the Emerson College Polling Center. Thanks for being here on Balance of Power. Spencer, I would imagine that there is a pretty large student population at Emerson that is on TikTok. So what do we need to know about the correlation between support of this looming ban and age here?
And I think, Kailey, that's the most important, is that there is a generational divide that we're seeing on this issue and other issues, but particularly when it comes to TikTok, that 18 to 29, and even though they're not in our survey, those under 18 are also using TikTok, and they would prefer to keep it. What we also find is that the minority population, particularly Black voters, 2-to-1 want to keep TikTok, about 54%. So it's interesting to see the political wins and the dynamics in play here on this issue.
Yeah. Well, and this isn't the only issue centered around kind of technology adoption and feeling around technology that does have these kind of distinctions, not just in terms of age, but also the other demographics you were pointing to, like minorities. You find kind of similar patterns when it comes to crypto, for example.
Yeah, exactly. In this survey, as we were looking at the data, I was thinking of my students, and I'm like, wow, the student population here, it's a lot different than the rest of us in our 30s or 40s or 50s, and then us in our 60s and 70s. You know, we really have different attitudes about cryptocurrency. We have different attitudes about TikTok. So these 18 to 29-year-olds, they're finding themselves as in a minority. So even on cryptocurrency, that's something that's really popular with about 18 to 49-year-olds. 18 to 39 is the sweet spot, but up to those 49-year-olds, they're still involved in it. But it's the minorities. They're 2-to-1 more likely to be involved in cryptocurrency than the white voter. And so we see here an opportunity in the economy for these younger voters that they see crypto as kind of their key to success. And that's also changing the political realignment of these voters, where they were really strong Democratic voters, and now 57% of those invested in crypto have a favorable opinion of Donald Trump. So what you're seeing is that swing of the vote, and we saw that play out in the election as well.
Yeah, we certainly did, and not just the presidential one, but down the ballot as well when we look at some of the congressional and Senate races in which there was a lot of crypto money at play. You alluded to, though, Spencer, this notion that for at least some group of the population, this is an economic issue, but there are also wider economic issues that would affect American consumers pretty much across the board at play now in the second Trump administration, including that of tariffs. I know you did some polling on that as well. Donald Trump had made no secret of his feelings around this and his support of more protectionist ideas on the campaign trail, and he won. But does the data suggest that really voters are feeling that protectionist, that supportive of tariffs?
Yeah, the voters are leaning on the side that the tariffs are going to hurt. About 50% think it's going to hurt. A little under 40% think it's going to be helpful. It's driven mostly on this by political ideology. So Republicans think that the tariffs are going to be helpful, about 55%. Democrats, 71% say no, they're going to hurt the economy. And the independents align with the Democrats on this issue. About 57% think it'll also hurt the economy. So that one's really being driven by political ideology, while we're seeing more of that age and generational divide on those other issues of crypto and TikTok.
Well, as we consider political ideology here and the president that is coming into the White House being very different in terms of ideology than the president who is outgoing, Joe Biden. There's just, 34 days left of Biden's presidency here. He's trying very hard to shape his legacy, in part on the economy, but everything else as well. How are people feeling about him, knowing that he's about to vacate the office?
They're kind of at the lowest point in their feeling for Joe Biden in our polling over the last 4 years. His approval ratings around 36%, disapproval about 54%, which are kind of the low and the high that we've seen over this administration. So it's right now kind of a down note. And then on top of it, that core constituency of younger voters, they're going to be upset with TikTok because he's kind of holding the bag, as you mentioned. It's on the 19th that this goes into effect. But Trump comes in on the 20th. So this could also impact his legacy with these younger voters who don't think, who want to keep TikTok and might blame the president if it gets taken away.
Is part of the reason, Spencer, before we let you go, that his approval is so low right now because of his pardon of his son, Hunter?
Yeah, the pardon was not popular either. 52% said they shouldn't have done that. About 30% were okay with it. So that's not a policy. Some of the pardons have kind of piled up on him in a more negative way. Also, I think, it's the end of the term, and what is going to be his lasting legacy? And we're going to have to wait to see. But right now, he's in a bit of turmoil in this administration as he's leaving office.
He certainly is. All right. Spencer Kimball of Emerson College bringing us the new data from Emerson's polling center, where he is the director. Thanks for being here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
And I want to go now live to Capitol Hill, where joining us from her office is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York. Thanks for your patience, Congresswoman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. If we could just begin with this continuing resolution that we haven't got eyes on it yet. Should the 72-hour rule be waived in this instance with the midnight Friday deadline? Would you be supportive of that?
I mean, it depends how much time is going to be cut from that 72 hours. I think there's a lot of members that rightfully so, including myself, would actually like to have the time to read the text, right? This is, we said we were done with the days of passing legislation to find out what's in it, right? And obviously, if these bills are hundreds, if not, 1,500 pages, that takes time to know exactly what we're voting on, because we do need to respond to our constituents. We do need to be held accountable by our constituents, and we should be. But we can't do that if we're voting on legislation without knowing all the details. And so I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of frustration among the membership right now, because we feel like these negotiations have been taking place and we're sort of left in the dark. It has not been a member-driven process. It's been a process driven by leadership. And unfortunately, we're kind of just waiting to see what happens. We shouldn't have to find out what's going on by searching Twitter. That's the bottom line. We are the lawmakers. We all have aspirations here of what we'd like to achieve for our constituents with this final package. I think it's frustrating to a lot of members that we're also seeing this negotiation with the Democrats when we're in the majority, and we should be talking among ourselves and figuring this out.
Well, and you will be in the majority still in the next Congress when the next deadline looms. March 14th, we understand we're going to be doing this whole song and dance over again. And given the narrowness of the majority you will be part of, it is likely that Democratic votes are going to be needed to carry funding over the finish line, Congresswoman. So how would you like to see Speaker Johnson handle it differently than the situation is currently being handled?
Well, I think next year, hopefully, we'll be in a much better situation, given that we will have a Republican trifecta. And I also think that with President Trump at the helm, with his leadership, that he will play a huge role in keeping us united and keeping us focused on the agenda, which is obviously starts with securing our border, the energy policies, the addressing some of the regulatory issues that have stymied investment and development and manufacturing in this country, as well as what is to me as a Ways and Means member in the House, most important, our tax legislation, which is, if this expires, it will be detrimental to our economy, to American families, because that single-handedly has helped create millions of jobs, lifted American wages, brought unemployment down to record lows, doubled the standard deduction. It lowered the corporate rate, the income tax rate. It eliminated the alternative minimum tax. And so all of that's at stake next year. And so we have to focus and prioritize these things early on.
Well, and your chairman on the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, has not been shy about saying he thinks if you want to get tax reform passed, it should be included in one big reconciliation package with the border and energy and other issues that are high on the incoming president's agenda. Where do you stand on that? How hard will it be to get tax reform passed if it is a separate package that comes later?
I agree with the chairman that we need to prioritize tax up front. There's just too much at stake, as I just laid out, if these provisions expire. Some have already begun to sunset or have expired. And I get concerned that if we do energy and border security without the tax piece, that there will not be cooperation from some of the members to focus on the tax piece. I think it needs to be done all together. So you have members from border states getting something, you have folks that are from energy producing states getting something, and you have, the fiscal hawks and the Ways and Means tax experts and tax writing committee members getting something as well. So we can help President Trump deliver some of these campaign promises with parameters, right, within reason, but deliver those campaign promises. And so we've done a lot of work in our committee, laying the groundwork, doing our tax team work, roundtables, hearings. We have an idea of our options that are on the table in terms of different parameters that would obviously adjust the cost and the impact. And so we need to work now to build consensus with our colleagues throughout the House.
Well, what about the SALT cap specifically? Bloomberg has reported Trump's economic team is looking at doubling it from 10,000 to 20,000. Is that enough for you?
Well, I think I'm certainly happy that there's something on the table, because we've been advocating for quite some time, the New York members, to get some sort of tax relief in terms of SALT, increasing the standard deduction, increasing the SALT deduction, doubling it for married couples, I think is a great starting point. We can work on what figures would be the right one. 20,000 may seem a little low for particularly some of the New York members. I'm willing to entertain that if we are also going to increase the standard deduction, as I have had legislation to do. And another important piece for me is the Social Security, the tax on Social Security. I have too many seniors in my district that are struggling paycheck to paycheck on Social Security. They have not adjusted those thresholds for taxable income in 40 years, my entire lifetime. We need to help protect seniors so they can keep more of their hard-earned money. So maybe a bonus deduction for seniors. If we can't adjust the thresholds. And so I think there's a lot of things on the table. There's a lot of moving parts. And obviously, every time you move a piece of the puzzle, something happens, right? And so it's a matter of figuring what is doable, what is reasonable, what is doable, and what could satisfy a majority of members to get this thing passed.
I want to ask you, Congresswoman, about something else I'm sure is capturing a lot of attention in your district and other districts in New York, New Jersey, all throughout the Northeast, and that is drones that are high in number and percolating around the sky. It's really unclear exactly what is going on and where these things are coming from. And I wonder what you have heard as a lawmaker and a member of Congress from authorities about this.
Well, unfortunately, we haven't heard much, and that is part of the frustration. And it seems that the federal agencies' stories seem to change. First, they were trying to convince us that these were just small manned aircrafts, and that we were misidentifying them as drones. Then they tried to convince us, well, yes, now they're commercial drones and recreational drones, And now they're even trying to tell us that these are stars in some cases that we're seeing and we're misidentifying for drones. It is ridiculous that the American people, and particularly members of Congress who have a responsibility to not just protect our constituency, but have a say in matters of national security, cannot get this information, cannot get a classified briefing. We're going to be offered a briefing today by the White House and Department of Homeland Security at 2:30 today, but it's not a classified briefing. And so I'm sure the information we're going to be receiving is the same stuff we've been seeing on Twitter, which is ludicrous. And so I'm very frustrated by this process. Personally, I believe that these are government operated drones. I don't know whether they're doing some type of counterterrorism activity or exercises, or maybe testing some new equipment for, our law enforcement or military. But the bottom line is they should be honest with the American people. If it's classified, they don't need to give us the details to the public. They should give it to the members of Congress. But at least say what it is in terms of that it is military exercises. That, I think, would be satisfactory to most people, to not think that we're somehow being invaded by another country or another planet.
Of course, Bloomberg can't confirm whether that is the case, as we don't have that information either. Just quickly, though, Congresswoman, in the interim, while everyone's trying to figure out what's going on, do you believe police in New York, other authorities, should have the authority to shoot these things down, or does that present its own kind of danger?
Well, I think in a densely populated area like New York, where we've seen these drones flying over military installations, residential communities, over buildings, over critical infrastructure like the Verrazano Bridge, obviously shooting them down is a concern. But where they're coming over the water shoreline, as we've heard happening in New Jersey, then they should be shot down. And if there needs to be better communication between these agencies. Like, if it is indeed, we find out that it is a federal agency that's operating these drones, wouldn't it be nice if our local law enforcement actually knew about it? If our local military installation knew about it? As far as I'm concerned, and that my conversations with them, they know nothing. They have no idea where these drones, who's operating these drones, and for what purpose. So there definitely is a lack of communication between the federal agencies and also with the different levels of government. Federal government doesn't seem to be keeping the state or the city informed, and that is, I think, very problematic.
All right, Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Happy holidays.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
We, of course, are wrapping up the 118th Congress this week and looking ahead to the 119th, which, of course, will bring with it Republican control of both the Senate and the House, leaving Democrats once again in the House minority. But that minority, as it begins to take shape, who will be having key roles in it, is starting to look generationally a little bit different. This is something we've talked about for weeks now, this notion that older members of the Democratic caucus are kind of being pushed aside for younger members of it. At least this is a pattern we had been seeing when you look to judiciary, for example, and Jerry Nadler having to bow out in favor of Jamie Raskin. And that led a question over who would be the ranking member on the Oversight Committee. And we saw this battle taking place between a very young member of Congress, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's 35, and Jerry Connolly, who's 74. And it turns out, in both the steering committee last night and in the general caucus today, Democrats opted for Connolly over AOC. We want to have more on what exactly this might mean for this generational shift we've been talking so much about, and turn to our political panel. Jeanne Zaino is with me, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside John Seaton, Republican strategist and founder and CEO of Echo Canyon Consulting. Jeanne, as the Democrat, I will come to you on this first. What does this say that Connolly triumphed over AOC?
I think it says that this is going to be a struggle for the Democrats to fully realize this generational shift. We saw some of it, as you just mentioned. Nadler was a perfect example to Raskin, but it didn't go so well for AOC. And I have to tell you, Kailey, I think it is a big mistake on the part of the Democrats The most important committee for the Democrats in the House this year is going to be oversight. They have completely lost Washington, D.C. in the last election. And we constantly hear talk about the fact that the Democrats weren't on message in the campaign. And there's truth to that. But the reality is that it wasn't only that they weren't on message, they are not adept at using the new media that they need to use to reach these voters that they're losing. And nobody is better at that in the House than AOC. And of course, we need her there to make these cases. She is so adept at it. I'm sure, you saw this, Kailey. After the election, she took to Instagram and asked people in her district, why did you vote for me and Donald Trump? And she got back fascinating responses about authenticity and posted all of those. This is the kind of conversation Democrats need. And, God love Jerry Connolly. It's not going to happen in that way. And so Democrats, I think, have made a mistake by going in that direction and heeding this notion of seniority.
So, John, is this good news for Republicans that it won't be AOC providing the direct counter to Jim Comer?
I'm not so sure. I think it's an interesting question, and she obviously does represent a much, younger version of the Democratic Party. She also represents a much more extreme version of the Democratic Party, and you only need to look to last month when she made some extremely inflammatory comments about AIPAC and the American-Israel relationship. She has definitely been on the left fringe of the party. There's a reason that reportedly anyway, former Speaker Pelosi was making phone calls and working hard against her ascension because she would really put a lot of Democrats, I think, in very, very uncomfortable positions. So Democrats did go with the safer option. It remains to be seen whether that was the wisest choice.
I want to ask you as well about something happening in the Republican conference, John, because separately, yesterday we learned Republican Congresswoman Victoria Spartz announced that she's going to opt out of serving on any committees next year and will no longer be taking place in Republican conference meetings. She says, though, she will be staying a registered Republican. But given that we know Republicans will be working with an incredibly tight majority, potentially only affording to lose one vote in the early days of the 119th Congress, is this going to be potentially a big problem?
Certainly any threat to getting to 218 votes could be a concern. I think Speaker Johnson has done a remarkably good job in keeping the caucus together as best he can. It's a caucus with a lot of strong personalities, and so this will be one more challenge for him to make sure that he can count to 218 when he brings legislation to the floor. I was a little surprised when I saw that, and I'm interested to see what it looks like in terms of fundraising. A lot of fundraising can be determined by which committees you sit on, and we'll see if she does remain a loyal Republican vote. Otherwise, it will be that much more difficult to pass legislation, especially with so many vacancies due to appointments into the Trump cabinet.
Well, she said the reason that she was opting out of all of this was because she, quote, doesn't need to be involved in circuses. Jeanne, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think it is a precursor of what is to come in the 219th Congress, or 119th. Sorry, that would be a long way. 119th, given how tight it is, and just one member who feels put out on the Republican side, who feels frustrated for any reason, to stand up and say they are going to step away in this way from committees. That's one thing. But imagine if they say they aren't going to vote with the Republicans. What does that mean for Mike Johnson? It means for everything from funding the government to immigration to crypto. I mean, the list just goes on and on. He has to deal with Democrats, and there's nothing that's going to frustrate Republicans more than that. And so this is the space that Mike Johnson finds himself in. I mean, he is just walking a tightrope. And, when I heard this, I said, wow, if she can do this and we haven't even got into the 119th, imagine what's in store for us just in a few weeks from now when they take government.
Yeah, we all have so much to look forward to in the early days, including, of course, what we understand will be pretty quick action that they're at least going to try to take on reconciliation. John, we know that the Senate incoming Majority Leader, John Thune, is advocating for 2 budget reconciliation packages, the first one dealing with border and energy, then dealing with a tax package later on. Members of the House, including Nicole Malliotakis, who I just talked to, who's on the Ways and Means Committee, would rather see it all done at once. Where do you come down on this? If they have success in getting one package through, does that make it that much harder to get the second one through or pave an easier path?
Yeah, so my only experience with this comes in 2005 after President Bush's reelection. And even he said that he probably should have done immigration before Social Security. You want to do the easier thing first. It's when you have the most political capital. It's when you have the most people who want to see those first 100 days be a success. So I thought that was a fascinating interview. I thought it was really, really interesting to kind of hear what the internal machinations are within the conference. I would expect they might want to do taxes first, but yeah, it remains to be seen. It will be a very interesting time. And again, informed by what I saw after President Bush's reelection, I know that they need to be very careful and deliberate in what they do first, because it's not going to be easier. It's not going to get any easier after those first 100 days.
Well, sure. And when we consider some of the thorny issues like the SALT cap, Jeanne, which you know very well, being a New York resident, I would imagine that that's going to be tricky, because there are a lot of Republican members who have expressed the fact that they will not be interested in voting for a tax package that doesn't materially lift that cap or do away with it altogether.
God bless them, Kailey. That's what I say. This has been an issue that has just, frustrated so many of us here in New York and elsewhere and this East Coast. But, that said, I think that the incoming president is going to be frustrated unless in that first 100 days, Congress moves with the speed in which he has been trying to move in this transition. I mean, he has talked, down to the minute almost what he plans to do day one. And, now we know, or we think that if they do get a CR, that's March 14th. That is a huge, huge challenge for the president in that first 100 days, because you're going to have a government funding fight on last year's funding. You're going to have immigration. You're going to have taxes. You're going to have crypto. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And all of these, you mentioned, this issue that so many of us care about here in SALT. All of these issues with such a narrow margin in the House make it very easy for one or two members to make Johnson and Trump's life difficult. So I think it makes the most sense to get a win. I agree completely. It makes most sense to get a win where you can get it. And since there is a lot of energy now behind immigration, that looks like a good place to start. That said, historically, immigration reform has been a bear. So I can't believe I'm saying optimistically that they should try to move fast on that. I don't know if historically it's going to be able to be realized.
Well, Jeanne, you're always good at keeping the historical perspective, including what you've been reminding us throughout the questions we have around the confirmation of Trump's nominees, that historically, if they get through the hearing, almost always they end up getting confirmed by the Senate. But John, as we see some of the more controversial nominees on the Hill this week, including HHS Secretary designate RFK Jr., what is your degree of confidence that he, Pete Hegseth, and Tulsi Gabbard, the three we've really been watching, are all going to make it through?
As we sit here now, I think all three are likely to be confirmed. I do think that their hearings will be important. I think that Democrats will be exercising their advice and consent responsibilities under the Constitution. But as of right now, despite some pretty tough press on all three of them, they still have the votes as we sit here now, or at least there's not 4 Republicans who have indicated that they're going to vote no. So while I do think it will be there's still a long way to go and it will be an arduous process from here to there, I expect all three to ultimately be confirmed.
And Jeanne, just quickly, we have a minute left here, but could any of these three not only get confirmed at all, but do so with Democratic votes getting them over the finish line?
We may see a few because, of course, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr. were formerly Democrats, and they do, particularly Tulsi Gabbard, have relationships with members of the Senate. That said, I think it's going to depend an awful lot on what happens with these FBI checks. And then, of course, as John mentioned, the hearings, they're going to be fascinating. With RFK, we are going to get some of the really, really difficult questions. We're also going to get questions about bears in Central Park, questions about worms on the brain. I mean, the list just goes on and on. So it's going to be must-see TV, if nothing else.
Indeed, just like Balance of Power is.
That's
Jeanne
right.
Zaino and John Seaton here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you for joining us, our political panel today.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We discuss what President Trump was saying yesterday in Mar-a-Lago. Yes, in part, his remarks did pertain to the conflict in Ukraine, but he touched a lot of other different subjects as well, including having to mount a defense for his Health and Human Services Secretary nominee, RFK Jr., who, of course, is making the rounds in the Senate this week, trying to plead his own case to senators. But Donald Trump was making the case for him as well. When asked a question by a journalist about RFK yesterday, this was his response.
I think he's going to be much less radical than you would think. I think he's got a very open mind, or I wouldn't have put him there. He's going to be very much less radical. But there are problems. I mean, we don't do as well as a lot of other nations, and those nations use nothing.
So we want to get more on RFK Jr. now as we consider the idea that he could lead the Health and Human Services Department, and turn to Dr. Leslie Kantor. She is chair of the Department of Urban Global Public Health at Rutgers University and is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Dr. Kantor, thank you for your time. When we consider RFK Jr. and the many ideas around public health, around vaccines he has put forward, what gives you greatest pause?
Well, let's start with the fact that we know that vaccines are safe and effective, and that over the past 50 years, more than 150 million lives have been saved around the world because of vaccines. Our biggest problem right now is that there is too much misinformation about vaccines, and that is making some parents unnecessarily frightened about vaccinating their children. We have a tremendous amount of data that shows that the vaccines that are recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics in this country are going to keep your kids from getting what could be very serious diseases.
Well, something else we heard from the president-elect yesterday was that he does not like vaccine mandates, which obviously we think about a lot when it comes to the required vaccines for children to attend school. What would happen if those were to go away?
Well, we can already see in many states that we are getting below what we would consider community immunity. We used to call it herd immunity, but we're trying to call it community immunity. For example, measles, which is extremely contagious, extremely deadly. You need 95% of people in a community to be vaccinated to make sure that no spread can get going. And we already see in many states that we are a little bit below that 95% mark. We're at more like 90% nationwide. So school mandates are one way to have a place where we make sure that children are vaccinated and that other children are not put at risk because they're unvaccinated kids going to school with them.
Well, and one vaccine we've heard a lot about in particular is the polio vaccine. RFK Jr. on the Hill yesterday seemed to suggest that he is supportive of it. Donald Trump says we're not going to lose it. How important is it that that is true, that people continue to be vaccinated against polio?
You know, I think for anybody who was alive and terrified when polio was around, my father is among those people, and he can't believe, and I don't think most of people that age can believe that we would ever for a second let up on the polio vaccine. One reason that you don't see any of the terrible outcomes of polio is because we are all vaccinated these days.
Well, of course, when we consider what would fall under RFK Jr.'s remit if he were to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, it's not just about vaccinations. There's obviously a number of other issues that pertain to public health, and Donald Trump has talked about some of the good ideas he sees RFK having in other arenas, including, for example, thoughts around food and nutrition and additives in our food. Can you weigh in on some of these other ideas that RFK has put forward and whether any of them, in your mind, do have merit in terms of thinking about better public health?
Sure. Well, to be clear, I am not a nutritionist, but I am familiar with some of the concerns about ultra-processed foods. I think that an examination of our food supply, trying to make people educated about what is important for nutrition. I mean, it is kind of stunning that 70% of our food supply now is considered having at least some ingredients associated with ultra-processed foods. So I think that is something that I think many public health and health professionals could get behind. But there's certainly a lot of concern about any misinformation spreading about things like vaccines or things like fluoride. I mean, if you look at any list of what the big public health accomplishments were between 1900 and 1999, when life expectancy went up so much in this country, you're going to see vaccines at the top. And then you're also going to see fluoride. And by the way, you'll also see family planning, which is something I've spent a lot of my career working on.
Well, and in our final 2 minutes here, I do want to talk to you about that, because RFK Jr. has actually faced backlash in some conservative circles for his more pro reproductive rights views that he has held in the past. Just quickly here, what is the relationship between reproductive health access and public health more widely?
Well, we know that when women can make decisions about their methods of birth control, that's absolutely essential to health. And of course, access to abortion is important for wanted pregnancies as well. The only way we can have maternal health in this country is to have access to the full range of reproductive health care.
And do you believe that the pivot we have seen from RFK Jr. After he has become the nominee, talking less about abortion rights, might translate into actual more restrictions on reproductive health?
I hope not, but we know that we do have an administration where a lot of people have very concerning attitudes towards abortion and also towards contraception.
All right, Dr. Leslie Kantor, chair of the Department of Urban Global Public Health at Rutgers University. Thanks for being here on Balance of Power, and stay close. I'm sure we're going to have much more reason to discuss many of these issues as we see the actual confirmation hearings and more of the process getting underway.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.